Hello, everybody, and welcome to this MEI webinar on gender and displacement in the Middle East and North Africa under COVID-19. My name is Hafsa Halawa. I'm a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, based in London in the UK. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us. We've got a wonderful panel lined up for today's discussion. This event is the second in a series launching MEI's new initiative on displacement and migration. This initiative will seek to bring together displaced people, experts, and advocates, delving into the most urgent issues facing refugees and IDPs in the Middle East North Africa region. You will find a link to more information on this series sent to you in the chat function by our support staff. We're looking forward to a great conversation in the upcoming hour. As I'm sure everyone is well versed with Zoom, we'll be taking audience questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the event. I will endeavour to have as many questions as possible responded to. We have about 40 minutes of discussion between myself and our wonderful panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for your questions, but please do submit at any time you wish. You can also submit your questions by emailing events@mei.edu. That's events@mei.edu, and they will be filtered and sent to me. So as I said, we're here today to talk about gender and displacement in the Middle East, experiences and vulnerabilities. As the global refugee crisis continues amid the spread of COVID-19 and economic collapse, displaced women face growing dangers in the region. Women refugees are at greater risk of domestic and gender-based violence, and many struggle with new roles as both primary income earners and sole caregivers of their children in unfamiliar environments. Additionally, sexist legal systems have become a push factor for women refugees, and insufficient legal protections exist for women refugees in many host countries. We're here today with our four speakers who I'll introduce. We have Shada Rahawi, who is herself a human rights activist and Syrian refugee now based in Germany. Shada is the co-founder of the Network for Refugee Voices and a steering committee member and the chairperson of the Global Refugee-Led Network. Shada is also a board member of the New Women Connectors and a former member of the European Migrant Advisory Board, which is an initiative of the Partnership on Inclusion of Migrants and Refugees, the Urban Agenda for the EU. We have with us also Devin Cohn, who's a senior advocate for Women and Girls Refugee International, focusing on Lebanon and Egypt. Devin, prior to joining Refugees International, Devin was also the Director of Protection Programs at HIAS, where she was responsible for providing technical expertise to their protection-related programming globally. Devin has also worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Lebanon, Uganda, Egypt, and Kenya. We also have Maryam Azir, who is the Middle East Regional Representative at the Malala Fund, focusing on Syrian refugees in Turkey and gender-based violence. She collaborates regularly with local NGOs to expand education initiatives for Syrian refugees and other vulnerable adolescents, especially girls. Prior to her work at the Malala Fund, she worked with UNICEF for 10 years in the Middle East, Africa, Caribbean, USA, and Europe. And finally, last but not least, we have Dalal Yassin, a program advisor at Al Shabaka, focusing on legal protections and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. She is a lawyer and advocate for gender and human rights for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And Dalal has previously worked with several Palestinian NGOs in Lebanon and formerly served as coordinator for the Right to Work campaign for Palestinian refugees there. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. It's a pleasure to have you with us. We're going to delve right in and start with you, Shada. I think a great scene setter for this discussion is your own experience as a Syrian refugee, your lived experience, and also working for a UN agency as a former refugee. So if you could just briefly give us some highlights of that experience and how it's affected your work. Thank you.
Yeah, hello everyone. Thanks for the invitation, and I would like to be useful in this discussion and add what I already experienced. As a refugee myself, since 6 years, I was struggling from seeking asylum, being in a different country, different culture, being a woman alone from the culture where we grow up with the surrounded family and everyone supporting us. It was not easy for me to be starting from scratch, being alone, fighting for my life with no support. There is no one there. There is different languages, different culture. Everything is new, and as you know, in the situation of seeking asylum and refugee life, it is also scary for a woman. As we know, women are more attacked to be raped, to be harassed, to be used for some kind. If you ask someone for support, he will directly try to benefit from that. He thought that you are weak, so you will be easy, and so many things like that. What helped me a lot that I was working in UNHCR in Syria for 8 years before I'm coming to being a refugee myself. So, and particularly, I used to work on LGBT cases. So it's my domain, that sexual gender-based violence. It's where I used to work. And before that, I also was working as a voluntary job with the, no, um, the nuns, like good shepherd nuns, yeah. So also we were having the first shelter and first hotline for women facing this domestic abuse and so on. So it given me actually a push to be standing for my rights, to understand where is the right place that I have to be in. I can share with you a story where maybe when I was seeking asylum, they asked us to be all of us in Germany in one place and sleep there. And then I saw that there is men and female and everyone, it's all together in one room. And it's so crowded. And I look like, okay, so what? And he said, yeah, just go and have a bed and that's it. And I like, no, I will not do it. It's my right. It's my right to have a separate room. Okay, not private room, but separate room from men. Like, and he said, no, this is what we have, and you are not a luxury here. This is what we offer, and so on. I said, look, I am a refugee, yes, but I'm not a dumb. I know my rights. I know what I can do. And seriously, it took me 2 hours to fight. And finally, I have a room where I am only with women. So, and other people like looking at me, and then the next day, the people asking me, the women, like, why you are creating this? Why? I said, this is my right, guys. So why? They said, no, but we are trying to be nice. Because I said, no, you cannot try to be nice if you have a right. It's your rights. It's not like a privilege from them. So it's in the law, your rights to have a special room, special space, and special toilets separated from the main one, and so on. So I understand from my journey actually that we are a woman even in outside our culture, because sometimes in MENA we thought that it's only us. But when I came here also, I saw that the gender issue is still a matter, still need to work on. It's even in Germany, in Europe, in US, we still not having our rights 100%. And we still find that there is a lot of misuse our life and our rights and so on.
Thank you so much, Shada, and thank you for sharing your stories. Considering your own experiences and your own journey in seeking asylum and being a refugee, what specific challenges do you think are made more acute by the outbreak of COVID-19?
Okay, yeah. Okay, as a female, there is a lot of problems that might be more for women than men. Why? As a female, you have to take care of your family. Most of the time, you are even alone, like a single mother with the children and so on. You have the problem of the language. You have to fight for. I'm speaking about refugees outside the MENA region. I'm just so you have another language, you have another culture. You are, even without COVID-19, you have a lot of problems and troubles to find job. It's not easy. So what added to that is also the technology knowledge now, because most of the work should be done from home. Sometimes, like even us, we are still struggling with this Zoom and other stuff, and so it's not easy. If you are looking for a work or a job, it's easy. And women in general, they are more putting in the service jobs, where like being in a service, which is restaurants or something, which is the most affected domain in the pandemic. So women lost the opportunity, the only opportunity that they can do it. So it's not easy. And also, even if they have a work, if the men have a work and women have a work, and now we have this pandemic, so the school were closed, so we need someone also to take care of the family. Again, it's the role of women to leave their works and being the taking care of the children and the family, not the men. So in this way, also women were affected so much. As we said, it's also about the mental issue and the domestic abuse. It's about also a lot of economic struggle. So many domains, it affecting both sides, both gender, but it's more about women, because always we are less um, uh, uh, you know uh, value the role of the woman. And somehow in the work, we will close your work, you will cut your work, but they will keep the men. I don't know why. And so many things like this. So I feel like, from my experience, it's not easy to keep what we achieved. Like, we achieved not that much, but still now in the space where we have to fight to keep what we gain. Otherwise, we will be before what we already achieved. Like, we fight a lot and a long to be here, and now we are slowly going back. So I think women have no more burden to educate themselves more, to try to find a space to learn, to have a new trainings or something like this. And it's a lot of struggle when you have. I fortunately have no children. Look, if I am having a children and I have interview like this, my kids will be jumping. And then I saw it so many times. It's really, it's not okay. The men will not take care of that. They will like leave it most of the time. So this is also something we need to work on that. And domestic abuse, because as I said, it's not easy sitting at home all together. So it's increased the domestic abuse.
Thank you so much, Shada. I'd like to move to Dalal, and apologies. I've been made aware that I made a mistake in the introduction. Dalal is actually the Executive Director of Middle East Voices at the moment, so my sincere apologies and correction to you, Dalal. Dalal, you work very much on challenges facing Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. Could you give us a brief introduction on the implications of COVID-19 on Palestinian women refugees, please?
Okay, first, thank you, Hafsa, for having me and today, and for moderating. First, let me talk a little bit about the challenging facing Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. The COVID-19 pandemic has come at a time when Lebanon is already struggling with collapsing economy. And this has deepened the impact on Palestinian refugees in general, especially women. Palestinian refugees were already the most vulnerable community in the country and have no protection to deal with the double impact of the economic crisis and COVID-19 at the same time. There is over 450,000 Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and they depend on UNRWA the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, to receive education, healthcare, relief, and social services. The Palestinian refugees in Lebanon do not enjoy the rights that other refugees have under international law. Palestinian refugees cannot work in almost 40 professions. They can't own property, and they are denied access to healthcare in Lebanon and Lebanese government hospitals. Even before the current situation, more than half of the Palestinian refugees live in camps. These camps are over 70 years old, and they are overcrowded. They have no clean water, no electricity, and have high rates of unemployment. Of course, Lebanon's law towards refugees violates its obligation under international law. So regarding the implications of COVID-19 on Palestinian women refugees, we have, in fact, it's very important to remember that you can't separate the problem facing Palestinian refugee women in Lebanon from the broader condition of Palestinian refugees in the country. We all know that women are affected differently than men by crisis and conflict, and their needs are also different. And there is also a difference between the impact on women who have legal rights and protection as citizens and women who are refugees. So Lebanon policies toward refugee women is a part of the larger discrimination against refugee in general, Palestinian or Syrian. And even before COVID-19, Palestinian and Syrian refugees were left off Lebanon's public health care or health service. For example, 2 years ago, the health ministry launched a national campaign for early detection of breast cancer. The campaign was aimed at Lebanese women only and excluded foreign women in Lebanon, including Palestinian and Syrian refugees. So staying indoors for protection from COVID has been very difficult for refugee women. They live in small houses, in crowded camps with no outdoor spaces, and some are living with large families. So houses should be safe spaces for women have become violent environments. Things are much worse for Palestinian refugee women than before. A recent study conducted by the Najdi Association in 7 Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon found that there has been a large increase in physical, verbal, sexual, emotional, and financial violence against refugee women. It also showed that young girls have been forced into early marriages. Hafsa, you're in silent.
Sorry, I've been on mute. There you go. No matter how many you do, always happens. Thank you, sorry, Dalal, for your very rich introduction. You mentioned very briefly, and I'd love to just get a couple of thoughts from you on the effect of what's happening in Lebanon currently, of course, the economic and political situation, and what kind of specific challenges that raises for increased risk for Palestinian women refugees.
Lebanon's financial crisis combined with the COVID-19 lockdown has negatively affected refugee women and girls on several levels. Lebanon adopted a number of measures to contain COVID-19. This includes relief for poor families. However, government support is not available to Palestinian and Syrian refugees. And because of the economic and political situation, high unemployment, discriminatory laws targeting the Palestinian refugees, and recent legal restrictions issued by Minister of Labor targeting Palestinian workers, women stepped in and took more responsibilities to search for alternative resources of income, like social assistance from different humanitarian organizations. Many families now cannot afford the rent or buying food for their children. Others have been forced to share housing and do not feel safe living with others, especially female members of the family. So the combination of Lebanese economic crisis and COVID-19 has made refugees even more vulnerable than before.
Thank you very much. I hope that we get to come back to this issue, because certainly the plight of refugees beyond the broader effect on Lebanon generally is very much ignored regularly. I'd like to move now to Devon. And for those of you who haven't, Devon recently wrote a really great brief for Refugees International called Gender Matters, COVID-19's outsized impact on displaced women and girls. And not to cheat, but Devon, I'd love if you could give us in a few minutes just an overview sort of your findings and the brief itself in how it relates to the gender displacement issue under COVID. Thank you.
Sure, thanks Hafsa, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for having us all. As Hafsa mentioned, I recently wrote a report called Gender Matters, and it really is a global look at the issues faced by women and girls that are displaced generally, and then how COVID-19 has affected or exacerbated those issues. And so I'm going to give a brief overview of that is a bit more global in scope, and then I'll dig down into a little bit more about how these issues have manifested themselves in the Middle East particularly. So just to give an update, there are about 79 million forcibly displaced people in the world, and more than 11 million of those are displaced within the Middle East. So of these, women and girls usually bear a higher brunt of the violence and the economic strain, the isolation, and other challenges that often accompany forced displacement, which the other panelists have just talked a bit about. And so in short, women and girls are disproportionately affected by displacement. And so because of these unique and disproportionate effects on women and girls, the organization that I work for, Refugees International, has dedicated an entire program to looking at these effects. And this is the program that I run. So the report that I wrote talks about a variety of issues faced by women and girls, including, and the first one that I really talk about is how the pandemic has affected access to livelihood and educational opportunities for everyone worldwide. But I would say that no population is more drastically affected than displaced women and girls. So as some of the other panelists mentioned as well, worldwide, women perform 3 times more unpaid caregiving work than do men, worldwide, whether they're displaced or not. So women account for 76.2% of the total hours worked in caregiving. So refugee and other displaced women do not escape this trend. And social norms, depending on the area where the refugee or displaced person comes from, social norms often dictate that they take care of children and elderly family members, and in some cases are managing the household and even being the economic providers. So these added responsibilities at home usually undermine women and girls' economic productivity and their opportunities. However, as some of the panelists also mentioned, having a source of income is critical for refugee women. Worldwide, at least 25% of refugee families are headed by female-headed households. So women are running the households and they don't have male providers or male companions or male family members that are helping them. So this economic uncertainty, which comes with displacement generally, and then also with COVID-19, further hinders girls' access to education. And oftentimes we're seeing in our research that families facing economic hardship, particularly those living in low-income countries, must weigh the financial opportunity costs of sending their children to school rather than to work or help at home. So related to all of this, the livelihoods and education, related to COVID-19, the authorities' decision to close schools in many places in order to prevent the spread of coronavirus, while it's to protect public health, of course, is likely to have really lasting negative consequences for girls. Once girls are taken out of school for any reason, they are both less likely than boys to engage in homeschooling and less likely to ever re-enroll. And then this is even more prevalent amongst displaced families and displaced women and girls. So also related to the economic challenges that come with COVID-19 and again with displacement, directly links to negative coping mechanisms and risks of exploitation that women and girls face. So these risks, especially for displaced women and girls, include transactional sex, forced and early marriage, sexual abuse, risks to human trafficking. And I will just plug something else. I wrote a new report we just published today, this morning, in fact, goes into the risks, particularly of gender-based violence faced by displaced women and girls because of COVID. And one of the pieces that I found, to be honest, most interesting but most alarming is the increased risk of human trafficking, given border closures and lack of legal entries, legal pathways to entry into countries. And then also the economic challenges that come with COVID. Another piece that I think is important to note is the challenge accessing health services. Some of the other panelists mentioned that as well, that many refugees and asylum seekers and even internally displaced people sometimes are not included in the national healthcare systems, and they're typically excluded, especially refugees and asylum seekers. And we know that women and girls have unique and consistent healthcare needs, sexual and reproductive health services, maternal health care. These are all things that are usually limited when women and girls are forcibly displaced. And then on top of that, because of COVID-19, we see resources, medical resources being diverted to treating and responding to COVID-19, while sometimes interrupting and disrupting and even stopping other healthcare services that women and girls always need. So another issue is the hygiene. And I'll be quick. I wanted to get a lot of this in, but I think we all have been given recommendations on good hygiene and how to practice good hygiene. But for many refugee and asylum seekers and displaced people, complying with these recommendations is very difficult. Living in crowded conditions, crowded camps or urban areas where 80 to 90% of refugees and forcibly displaced people in the Middle East live. So that's a particular unique complication, I would say, but also a unique aspect of asylum seekers and refugees in the Middle East is that oftentimes they're living in urban areas. I appreciate what Shaza said about bathroom facilities, whether it's in Germany or in Greek refugee camps with Syrian and Afghan asylum seekers, or whether it's in other camps or even urban areas, having sex-segregated latrines is key to avoiding sexual and gender-based violence. And it's a pretty simple solution, if you will, or a way to mitigate some of these issues. But again, related to COVID-19, when women and girls are told, go wash your hands often, go, have good hygiene and practice good hygiene, if they're not feeling safe walking long distances to those areas or accessing hand washing and latrine facilities where they're not sex segregated, then, that's really, it's just not, women and girls, especially that are already in vulnerable positions, should not be expected to choose between their health and their safety, which is often what is happening. So those are some of the issues. There's a lot of others. I would say one last thing is that gender-based violence is really a huge issue, and it always has been. And even before COVID-19, I look at humanitarian crises a lot, and before COVID-19, between 2016 and 2018, donors and aid organizations allocated only 0.12% of all humanitarian funding to GBV prevention, mitigation, and response activities. So that means of all the funding, 0.12% went to these activities, which are crucial and they're life-saving. And certainly in COVID-19, we've seen reporting that is not related to refugees and asylum seekers about how gender-based violence, and particularly intimate partner violence or domestic violence, has just dramatically shot up worldwide, in the US, in the UK, in other areas, really around the world. It doesn't matter kind of what the income level of a country is. That has really increased, and certainly with refugees and asylum seekers, those risks have dramatically increased as well. And so, even in some of the most conflict-affected settings, intimate partner violence or domestic violence is the most common form of gender-based violence. And so measures need to be taken to deal with that, because again, as quarantines have been required and lockdowns, not only does gender-based violence increase, but actually the reporting often decreases because, for obvious reasons, women and girls are stuck in the household and locked down with their abusers often, so that access to service is very difficult.
Thank you, Devon. And just as we turn to Mariam, just to remind everyone to please, if you have questions, do submit them in the Q&A. And a reminder to all our speakers that I will revert back to you guys, hopefully for some policy recommendations on what you think in this current moment can be achieved or done in the short term or in longer term programming. But moving to Mariam, Mariam, you have the vantage point of working with refugees, in both Lebanon and Turkey. So slightly comparative, but can you just give us an introduction to your experience and maybe either differences or certain challenges in one country over another for women and girls, displaced women and girls during the era of COVID? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this during this discussion. I think Lebanon and Turkey are two key countries in the Syrian refugee crisis, because the former is hosting the highest number of Syrian refugees per capita, and while Turkey is hosting 83% of the Syrian refugees globally. And also, when we think about the region, global gender equality indicators in both countries in the region and in both countries are low, with Lebanon ranking 145th and Turkey 130th out of 153 countries. And today, both countries are facing a depreciation of the local currency, high inflation affecting purchasing power, with Lebanon's case extremely severe due to the multiple and unprecedented crises that have been hitting almost everyone in the country. And with of course, with the further implications of the COVID-19 outbreak in both countries, there were very strict lockdowns put in place. And for example, in Turkey, all 0 to 20-year-olds and over 65-year-olds were banned from going outdoors for almost 2 months. So there's a lot of factors that have led to increased vulnerabilities, and there's a broad range of issues that are affecting especially women and girls. I would say also specifically adolescent girls. With the COVID-19, top priorities that have been reported by Syrian refugees have been, in Lebanon and Turkey, have been basic needs, cash for food and rent, and hygiene kits. And with the lack of livelihood opportunities, the most vulnerable are at heightened risk of different forms of gender-based violence. And this is, when we're talking about livelihoods, women in the region have also for a long time been the least, have been disadvantaged in terms of being economically empowered. And in terms of their participation in the formal labor market, and refugees are particularly affected and at a disadvantage. In Lebanon, refugees are restricted to working in only 3 or so sectors. And in Turkey, Syrian refugees face the particular barrier of the language. And whilst more and more families struggle to survive, they will be resorting to more negative coping mechanisms. And one of these is child marriage or early marriage. It's often perceived as a means of survival and protection for the daughter. In Lebanon, one of the things that shows that increased vulnerabilities directly affect child marriage rates is that in the region, the child marriage rates among Syrian refugee girls more than doubled since the conflict started in Syria. And then there's also, as also has been mentioned by other panelists, the need for, with the need to survive, there's a heightened risk of exploitation, human trafficking, child labor, survival or transactional sex, and this affects especially women and adolescent girls. So also what's already been discussed are the specific traditional roles that women hold in terms of caregiving responsibilities that are also affecting a lot of adolescent girls that we're hearing from the field, that they're spending a lot more time in domestic work and caregiving responsibilities. And another group that, I mean, I think this was also mentioned, that when you have single parent or female-headed households, like in Turkey, nearly 1 in 5 refugee households are female-headed. They are also found to be significantly more likely to be multidimensionally poor in terms of health, education, and living standards, with limited work opportunities. And with child labor, nearly half of refugee households in the region relied on some kind of child labor for income for basic needs. I think also with unaccompanied and separated refugee and migrant children, you see, there was a recent UNICEF report on this, on displacement in Europe. You see heightened risks of gender-based violence and unaccompanied and separated children being more exposed to psychological distress, sexual abuse, and violence. And then, of course, we have to take into account that women and girls who are lacking civil and legal documentation, for example, some 78% of Syrian refugees in Lebanon are without legal residency. So these leave women and young people at, at heightened risk for abuse, exploitation, or violence. Another thing that I wanted to highlight is, and this has also been mentioned, that quality education, whether it's formal or non-formal, is key in protecting adolescents from gender-based violence and in empowering girls. But this is being severely affected by COVID-19. Prior to COVID-19, adolescents were falling through the gaps, both girls and boys, in terms of Syrian refugee adolescents. Fewer than 10% of Syrian refugee adolescents were in education in Lebanon. And these are leaving them vulnerable to, especially, for example, criminal networks. If we look at the region, the southeastern region in Turkey on the border of Syria. And with the pandemic, one very concerning thing that a recent Malala Fund report calculated is that an additional 20 million secondary school-aged girls could drop out of school after the pandemic as a result. So very much in line with what Devin was mentioning earlier. And this is in Lebanon, the school closures have been taking place already prior to the COVID-19 pandemic because of the road blockages and the political crisis that has been ongoing. So these raise particular concerns for adolescent girls especially. And a third thing that I wanted to mention is that as girls are struggling, adolescent girls are struggling for basic necessities, also their access to rights and services, what's often overlooked. And, we were talking about hygiene. What is often overlooked is the gendered implication of the economic hardship, where women and adolescent girls are being forced to deprioritize their menstrual hygiene needs. And in Lebanon, with the economic crisis, hygiene products have become unaffordable, even for many Lebanese women and girls. And 2/3 of Syrian refugee girls are saying that they do not have access to sanitary supplies and cannot afford them, according to a Plan International survey on the impact of COVID-19. So girls and women are opting for cheaper alternatives that are not ideal in terms of a hygiene, comfort, or medical perspective. And this is an issue of dignity and has implications on girls' freedom of movement, their access to education, health, as well as mental health. Often they'll be staying in the tents because they don't want to move around when they're having their periods. So this is really has a wider impact. So really, I think that these are a few key issues that, including the dignity of adolescent girls, that should be considered. And with education, it's also very key in protecting adolescent girls and creating, as well as creating healthier societies and promoting long-term peace. We have a Malala Fund report also that shows that doubling the percentage of youth education doubling the percentage of youth in secondary education can have the potential to reduce conflict by half. So this is an important note as well to take into account in terms of the longer term implications.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Really interesting from all of you. Thank you very much, all of your own personal experiences, but also highlighting the incredibly important challenges that we have to remember while we're dealing with COVID. I personally have done a lot of work and research with mainly Iraq's IDP community displaced from the war against Islamic State. And it's been interesting listening to you all that there isn't really, in terms of the challenges that you're talking about, both pre-COVID or exacerbated by COVID, really being different, even if you're internally displaced within your own sort of national borders. I think the only thing really highlighting particularly what Dalal and Devon mentioned is that the access to healthcare is a bit more, there's a bit more availability for it because, of course, being Iraqi nationals, although displaced, I mean, there are certain issues in terms of access, and particularly for those in the liberated areas where there's very little infrastructure. So people have to travel for miles and miles to reach any form of maternal health facilities or just general hospitals and stuff. I mean, I did research last year that saw that many people in the Nainiwal Plains were actually traveling to Syria for treatment in northeastern parts of Syria because the journey was so much more expensive within Iraq than to actually just cross the border and try and seek treatment in northeastern Syria. So really interesting dynamics. We have a variety of different questions. I'm going to endeavor to have everybody answer them. This one is for everyone. If you could keep your responses as brief as possible so we have about 20 minutes left for questions, and I'd like to get as many of them in. I thought we'd kick it off with quite a combative question in the sense that one of the things, this is from a question from the audience, one of the things that I keep thinking about is resilience, which is a buzzword in the aid industry these days. Could you all give very brief views on the question of resilience, and if, as the narrative goes, that women have become more resilient and stronger, does this result in stronger feminist-like demands by women in the future? Shada, let's start with you, but please keep your comments brief, everyone.
Yeah, actually, in our new Women Connector platform, we are focusing on resilience because we don't want to present women as victims anymore, and women shows the resilience seriously in many ways. So we had as a webinar last few weeks, and it was with refugee women, and we saw a lot of experience about how women are trying to stand up and fight all these struggles to be stronger, and we are trying more and more to support them in their way. So what we need more now to focus more how we support those people, because they know what they need, they know what they have and how can make it better more than anyone else. And this is what we are focusing on. Actually, we need to listen to them and then supporting them by donors.
Okay, thank you so much. Dalal, would you like to comment? You're muted.
I think in terms of your question is using CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is perfect to deal with this. So I think for refugees in Lebanon, Lebanon must take responsibility for protecting refugees on its territory, and Lebanon should also apply civil and social human rights convention on Palestinian refugees. It must implement CEDAW for all, as I said, for all refugee women. Lebanon signed CEDAW but has not implemented it for refugee women. At the same time, UNRWA should do much more work for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and for women. So they should increase resources for sexual and gender-based violence and adopt the UNHCR's guideline to needs of Palestinian refugee women.
Thank you, Dalal. Devon, do you have any brief comments?
Sure. I would just say that's a really great question, because I think that, just like Shada said, we need to focus more on, the resiliency of women and girls and kind of their capabilities and what they bring to their refugee and displaced, person's experience. And I think that in particular, even in COVID-19, we've seen many aid organizations not have access to places that they once did. And whereas they used to take leadership roles, now they're having to rely on displaced communities to take the leadership roles themselves, and they're doing an excellent job. And I hope and think that that will be a trend that continues well past COVID-19. I also think that when it comes to women and girls, but particularly women taking on additional and different roles that they might have not otherwise had they not been displaced, I think that while that's definitely challenging and presents risks and challenges and stresses, it also presents opportunities. And so I've certainly met many dozens and dozens of women in the field that, while they wouldn't like to be a female-headed household, they've really stepped up and taken on roles that they otherwise might not even have the opportunity to do, whether in their home country or because, the family was intact, whereas now it might not be. So I think those are two points related to that.
Thank you very much. And Mariam, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, yes. I mean, I'd like to underline what was said regarding that local, the people on the ground and women and girls are resilient. And this is sometimes, I think it's something that we forget. And when we're talking about resilience, I think it's very important to work on, if we're talking about the humanitarian and development community, then to really factor in gender mainstreaming into everything, and to really work on gender equality and building that to empower women, so that, because at the end of the day, then it's also benefiting societies and economies at large. So everybody benefits from that.
Thank you very much. I guess I thought it was a bit combative because I come from a more donor environment where I think we've reached a point where we overuse the word resilience, or we take for granted this idea of resilience, not just for women and girls, but just generally that citizens, refugees, those affected by conflict are just inherently resilient and almost, we lack the nuance of resilience versus sort of protection and other needs and things. So, but thank you very much for your comments on that. Shada, I'd like to ask you a serious specific question that's come in. How do you think women's inclusion in mediation processes for some of these crises could impact refugee women and girls in the Syria context? What are your comments on that?
Oh,
I thought
it's
so.
Yeah, seriously, it's hard. Actually, we have two groups. Like, we have Syrians inside Syria and we have Syrians outside Syrians. Like, I think the Syrians outside Syria now, they are trying more and more to have more role, and it's open more for them to have possibilities, potentials, and so others. So maybe those people, and I know a lot of my friends are trying to start now something to go back when the situation is a little bit better, to start building a new Syrian. It's friendly for women, if we can say, or for gender. But for Syrians inside Syria, I think it's really hard because they are struggling. They have no resources. They have a lot of stress. They have a lot of obstacles in their way. So it's more about thinking about their daily life than thinking about what they can do. Although they still trying to fight for their rights. They're still trying to start something which is help them more. But seriously, it's not easy. But I am hopefully can say we have something optimistic coming on, because Syrians outside are trying really hard to have a lot of NGOs and so many people and donors and the international community to support. And we are just waiting the right moment where we can maybe go back and try to start building a new system or new government, which is a little bit good.
Thank
But
you.
seriously, it's just not easy.
No, I know it's not. And actually, from my work with the sort of the Syrian feminist movement and women's organizations, there's I think one of the things that's really come about in the last sort of 1 or 2 years is the real need to build networks between not just those inside Syria with those displaced abroad, but also within Syria, the different, the lack of communication across different sort of conflict lines, if that's what we're going to call it, in terms of also engaging for a broader, inclusive feminist agenda for Syrian women. And I'm always been very heartened and impressed by just the sheer will of Syrian women inside Syria, in the neighboring countries, further afield, who remain so committed to this agenda across the board and having an inclusive agenda as well. My eye's on the clock. We have 10 minutes. I want to make sure that each of you has a minute to give me policy recommendations in closing. So just an eye on that to get a few more questions in. Please be brief. I'm gonna, Devon, this one for you. What are some of the biggest challenges faced by civil society, CSOs, NGOs, and even government authorities in responding to the needs of forcibly displaced women and girls?
I think there are a lot. I think that one thing is, again, the funding priorities. I think for both donors and NGOs, to be quite honest, even within our own countries, governments, and organizations, putting forth these needs of women, but also their resiliency and their capabilities, and highlighting those and bringing those to the forefront, I think is a challenge. And I think that that's one of the challenges. I think that another challenge is working, again, within communities and both displaced communities, but also host country communities that might be reticent to adopting some of the initiatives and changes and programs that need to be implemented. And then finally, I think just kind of all of the things I said about, well, I guess I'd say one more thing is kind of the legal recourse. I think when it comes to gender-based violence in particular, for refugee women and girls, often, if you're a refugee or an asylum seeker, the legal rights you certainly have legal rights under international protection and under the institutions created around refugee law and international protection. But that being said, oftentimes kind of that legal recourse and the access to legal services and legal aid and justice really is limited. Often it's limited in the host country government itself, but also, for refugees and asylum seekers, there's not being a citizen makes it even more difficult to access some of those services and some of that legal recourse. So I think that those are some of the challenges, certainly unique to refugee women and girls, that donors and governments and NGOs have to grapple with. And then I think, as we're talking about this in the context of COVID, I mean, that adds a whole other layer of issues, which I highlight in different reports, but the action needed to be taken on these issues is the next step. So I think that and when I say COVID-19, the challenges, I mean the challenges with access, the challenging with funding, the challenges with attention, and attention span on certain things that are not in the public limelight. So I think all those things are difficult.
Thank you so much, Devon. Mariam, I'd like to go to you with this one. I'm not sure how much information you have about this, but we have a question about the ability or the information about humanitarian aid under COVID, particularly with new realities in Lebanon. If you have any insights into how UNHCR is coping, but also in that sense, sorry, just trying to find it, with the COVID impact specifically, do you have any recommendations on the type of home livelihoods and schooling? It's been mentioned, this idea of telework and distance learning actually is a hindrance to women's economic security as refugees, but if you have any recommendations on that as well, briefly, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, well, with the humanitarian aid, I don't have specific information on that, but I do know that a lot of the sectors, as you know, a lot of funding has been cut down, and one of the sectors severely affected is education in Lebanon for a variety of reasons. But this is something that will have long-term impact. And at the same time, there are a lot of initiatives going on to look at what other ways how can we reach, I mean, if we're talking about the education sector, how can we reach the most disadvantaged populations who are being affected by the digital divide. So really with you know, with this is another layer to consider. When the education, you know, the nature of education has changed with COVID-19. And in terms of livelihoods and schooling, I think, you know, when we're talking about displaced people, we really need to also look into the other different types of innovative forms of empowering girls through learning and creating livelihood opportunities. So one of these is which has been a growing issue, is technical and vocational education, and then non-formal education, in which a lot of children who do have other obligations can sort of work around their, you know, with a more flexible schedule. And also these are realities that with the education sector, the public education sector being overwhelmed, especially now in Lebanon, where, you know, they're anticipating more and more Lebanese going into the public sector. So then, you know, there needs to be a lot of creative solutions to look at what opportunities are there for girls and boys to keep learning, and allowing for this kind of very extreme situation, how to manage the realities of that in terms of the need for economic survival.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but Dalal, I want to make sure that I get these questions to you. One is specifically, and if you could be brief so we can wrap up on time, but one question that comes in is how COVID-19 has created further barriers for women and girls accessing healthcare within refugee camp settings. And you've talked at length about the situation for Palestinians, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And we've had some comments on health, on access and hygiene and healthcare itself. But if you could just give a couple of points specific to the experience of Palestinian refugees in camps in Lebanon, and also, are there any specific needs of older refugee women that you see that differ from the broader sort of female refugee population that need tackling? Thank you.
As I mentioned, of course, as I mentioned before, that COVID-19 affected women very hard. So I mentioned a study about the increase of violence against Palestinian refugee women during the lockdown. And I have, for example, the study showed around 70% Palestinian women, and we're not talking now, not elderly or girls or women. So in general, the women who were participated in the study reported domestic violence from a male member or of a family, which usually father, husband, grandfather, uncle, or male sibling. So 55% were subject to verbal violence, 41 reported physical violence, and 35% were subject to financial violence, and 8% of the women were subject to sexual violence. So I would say that in general, unfortunately, Lebanon does not provide any support to refugees, or to other migrant workers. So Lebanon is not a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention. This means that refugees, asylum seekers have very, very few legal protection. And of course, Lebanon still has duties and obligations under international law, including Human Rights Convention. UNRWA provide support to Palestinian refugees, but UNRWA services have faced deep cuts after the Trump administration ended the US funding. And as you know, as Devin and Miriam mentioned, the situation of Syrian refugees is not and Lebanon is not better, but I would mention that the US was the UNRWA largest donor and gave $36 million annually. UNRWA began in 2020 with a debt of 55 million, and member states have not fully funded the agency's $1.4 billion budget. At the beginning of the COVID-19, UNRWA initiated an emergency plan. The agency based its facility implemented awareness campaign within the Palestinian refugees in camp and gathering in Lebanon, and announced they would cover some of the expenses. However, the plan did not include a provision to improve the economic situation or condition of the refugees in general suffering due to the closure. So as I said, even before COVID, before COVID, because of the cut, there are issues of adequate care and available services. Based on the latest, just let me, in the latest UNRWA figures, there are now around 89 COVID cases in the camps, among refugees in the camp.
Thank you for that. And it was important to get that in. We are out of time, but I promised our audience at least one policy recommendation from each of you. So you have 10 seconds and one sentence each, and I will mute you. No, I won't, I'm not that mean, but I will look agitated just because everybody obviously has other things to do. But if we can go backwards, so start with Mariam, then Devin, then Dalal, then Shada. One sentence, 10 seconds, one policy recommendation that you would like to get across. Mariam, go for it.
We need to invest in working on shifting social norms to address gender equality and prevent gender-based violence.
Thank you very much. Devin, please.
I would say prioritize economic sustainability and also including refugees and asylum seekers in their own response.
Thank you. And Dalal?
Lebanon must take responsibility for protection refugees on its territory.
Very true. And Shada, last word?
Yeah, actually giving more attention to refugees, to include them in their policy making tables and meetings.
Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for the great policy recommendations. Thanks to our audience. Thank you very much to our speakers and to MEI. A quick shout out to a couple of back-end staff who've been working tirelessly to put this together. So to Jill, Sophia and Isabel, thank you. To Jess Agostinelli and to Colin Tate, who without them this wouldn't happen. Thank you all. I wish you all a wonderful afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane, and looking forward to engaging with you all again. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, Hafsa.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.